welcome to another exciting episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode, we are continuing on with our VCA 6 series. Joining us back in the studio for a part 2 on storage technologies is our good friend, Mr. Ronnie Wong. Ronnie, welcome back to the show, sir.
Well, thank you again for having me back on as we continue on with our storage technologies. There's a little bit more that we need to take a look at, and the reason why is because I talked way too long on part 1, of course. But we want to actually continue on and take a look at some of the technologies that really affect users more than anything else, or even network admins as far as the management goes. Now, one of the things that we tend to do, or network administrators, server administrators, system administrators, whatever you want to call them, okay, is build VMs, right? Well, the problem with building VMs when it comes down to storage is that you have a couple of different philosophies here, okay? One, of course, is the system admin that says, here's the server that I need, and you ask how much storage that they want. And Daniel, usually it's like as much as you can give me. That's what it comes down to, okay? As much as you can give me. Well, the problem with that is fairly simple, is that may be a tiny bit, okay? Or it may actually be an incredible amount of space here. But somebody probably has come up with a policy and saying, if you're going to build a server, here's how big of a storage space you're going to get.
It'd be funny to hand that person a floppy disk and say, there you go, that's as much as I can give you.
That would be funny if you could actually do that and somebody
still
would
keep a job.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but that's one of the big problems, right? So what in the world started happening in the world of virtualization? What was simple, okay, is that even as a home user, right, you go, all right, so here it is. I'm going to build a perfect VM of my Windows XP or whatever it might be that you want to build. And so, when you actually go through the menu and actually offers you chances to actually build, well, you simply say, it's going to be 60 gigs or whatever it might be, okay? And then you go ahead and you build that and you run it, and then first time you launch into it and you find out how much storage space you have, it shows you that you have like a potential, you actually have a 60 gig hard drive, but you're only using like 10% of it or something. I mean, it shows you that you're not using very much. And if you then go into your file system where you're actually running that type 2 hypervisor, you actually see where the file's actually like very small. It's maybe a gig, maybe 3 or 4 gigs. I'm like, wait a minute, I provisioned 60 gigs for this thing. It's only showing 2 or 3. And that is because of something that is called thin provisioning, is what that's technically called. Now, in the type 2 hypervisor world, right, in the hosted hypervisor world, where you actually are clicking, it just tells you, the kind of differences between this. There's what we call thick provisioning. There's what we call thin provisioning, okay? And so when you start having something like that, well, why do you choose one over the other, okay? Thick provisioning will do this instead. When you actually create that VM, okay, what will end up happening is it will say, all right, you want a 60 gig hard drive? Here's what I'm going to do. On that particular appliance, I'm going to actually make a file. That's going to be the hard drive, and it's going to be 60 gigs in size immediately, okay? And so you will have access to that, and nobody else will have access to that disk storage space. That 60 gigs is yours and yours alone, okay? So that absolutely is something that we can actually do, okay? Thin provisioning, though, especially on desktop appliances, is something that's actually really neat because it conserves the space, and it says, Ronnie, instead, when you actually create this hard drive, we're going to actually say that the 60 gigs is yours, so you can expand it out to 60 gigs, but we're only going to really take up how much space it's really taking up right now, okay? So in other words, the machine can actually continue to expand up to 60 gigs, or if I actually remove stuff, it can actually collapse it down to however much space it actually is going to take up and take that away, okay? Now in this sense, it actually does conserve then storage space, and this is something that we want to actually understand, especially when we start dealing with VMware's vSphere environment too. So the same thing is actually applied. Let me show you here, okay? So when I go into my client here, and I'm on the web connection into vSphere, let me zoom in just a little bit more, okay? And I want to create a VM. This is actually going to be created right here on the cluster because I do have a cluster. If I right click, I select new machine, virtual machine, and I can select that, and we're going to walk through some of it. We're not actually going to create it, but I want to show you the options and where you actually do the provisioning here, okay? So it's when you actually create a new virtual machine that you'll do this. So if I click next, I'm going to give it a name, and we'll call this one VCA 6 is what we'll call it. And then it's asking me where do I want to place it, data center A, data center B. I'm just going to leave it at A for right now. And now it's going to take a look and it actually realizes something. Because I do not have some of the clustering technology turned on, like DRS mode, right? DRS is not turned on. It's like, Ronnie, you're trying to put this on a cluster and you don't have it turned on, and the problem is I'm not going to allow you to do that. So what you have to do here is expand it out and pick one of the hosts. Now, if I had DRS turned on, I could leave it at a cluster and it says, I will decide where to put it. You don't have to worry about it. Let me decide. I'll put it in the best possible location. So if we had all that technology turned on and ready to go, that's what we would do. But because we don't, I select a host, continue on, and it makes it fairly easy. I select that one, and then there's actually other policies that are in place, and this is what will affect us as well. So there's actually, of course, data store policies, there's a virtual volume, no requirements policy, and then there's a virtual SAN default storage policy, you name it. I'm just going to leave it at the default and click next here. Because I want us to get to something else here, it's going to be on ESX6 because that's the actual ESX server we have. And then I can select whatever operating system, and let's just do Windows here, just because it's actually there. Now it's right here. This is where I have to slow down and actually kind of expand something out. Okay. Now when you take a look, you see, oh look, 40 gig hard drive. What other choices would I make? Well, normally with that default policy, you make no other choices. But if I expand that out, let me now zoom in right here to the middle, and that way we can actually take a look. Notice the disk provisioning is all grayed out. And that's due to one of those policies, right? What VMware says is, hey, let me decide what this disk should look like. It should expand or contract or do whatever else we have. And usually thin provisioning is that. It says, if you say, I need a 40 gig hard drive, I'll dedicate that 40 gig space to you, okay? But only when you really need it. Okay? If you don't need it, I'm not going to take up a file that's going to be your virtual hard drive here and just leave it at 40 gigs to take up room. Now, can you do that? Yes, if you go back and choose that the no requirements option, that will actually expand out. But notice they have thick provision lazy zeroed, okay? And then they have thick provision eager zeroed. Well, what the heck is the difference there when you have something? Well, it actually depends on the drive that you're going to store this on. If I have data on that particular drive, okay, that I'm going to store data on, and I don't want a chance of losing that data, I'm going to actually pick this thick provision lazy zeroed here. Okay? If I want to make sure that that file is actually expanded out to 40 gigs, but I want to make sure I don't overwrite anybody else's data, here it is. Okay? It's actually going to keep that data. So when they talk about lazy zeroing, they're saying, look, we're not going to overwrite space that's taken up. We'll overwrite free space, but we're not going to overwrite space that's already taken up. Eager zeroed says, look, you need 40 gigs. I'm going to take up 40 gigs. Regardless of where I put it, if there's data there, I'm going to wipe it out. I'm going to zero it out completely. And that's the difference between that. And then thin provisioning says, you need 40 gigs. The actual appliance says, I'll give you 40 gigs, but you're only going to take up the space that you need up to the 40 gigs instead. So they'll provision the space, but they'll only really take up that much hard drive. So here you see by default, the default policy is thin provisioning. Now this is where in our shop we probably would have a little bit of a battle of what we want to do. And the reason why is that we found out something. When you actually do this kind of, in Microsoft land they call it dynamic, is what they call it, right? Because it expands and it contracts here. Well, we found out in a production environment, that causes a lot of disk I/O, a ton of disk I/O, because constantly recalculating how much space that there is, and that means more write cycles and more compute cycles, you name it. And so a lot of times when we actually build something for the production environment, old Ronnie Wong here says, hey, thick provision the sucker. Okay, that's what he says. Now, the default policy, in other words, VMware, the guys that are smarter than me say, no, thin provisioning is the way you want to go. So I hate to say it, maybe thin provisioning is the way to go. Maybe Ronnie's been wrong all this time. So you do have that issue there. So just kind of be aware if you're actually going to be talking about provisioning and thick provisioning or thin provisioning, that's where you actually set it up, and that's what you have to know.
Maybe VMware is a little better at dynamic disks than Microsoft is. That very well. I mean,
no doubt.
You got to remember, VMware's in the business of doing virtualization. Microsoft is in the business of creating servers, and they do virtualization as well. So if I had to put my money on one that might have better performance, it's probably going to go to the VMware side.
I would tend to agree. Yeah, but like I said, we've actually just found that out to be the. When it comes down to what we've done in production, every time we said, do we want to try this? And we try it, and it does. It works so much slower than what we need. We normally make sure we back that thing up. We create a new thick provision, and it just works so much better. And so that's been our historical performance. If I get emails about, Ronnie, you're completely wrong, I understand, okay? But at least historically from what we've done in the environment that we've worked, we think provisioning is the way to go on a production. Now, on my machine, would I do that? No, because I'd take up so much hard drive space on just VMs. I wouldn't have any hard drive space left, so I always do thin provisioning there.
I believe I've actually seen that on Ronnie's computer. I remember we looked at his drive and it had not 8 gigs, 8 megs of space left. And to its credit, it was still running like a champion, but you did have to free some space up.
I did. Yeah, I immediately freed space up after that show. But yes, I have seen that happen. So that's one of the things that you do need to think about. Okay. So thin provisioning, thick provision. Remember, that's actually at the VM level is where we actually are. So we're not talking about the block. We're not talking about the overall data center itself. But that's where you actually provision your VMs to work.
Yeah, right. Well, I guess a good next stop to take this bus to is the SAN capabilities, right? This thing has a virtual SAN. We can use that. We can make that a thing, and it has some pretty cool features built into that, right?
It really does. When we start taking a look at the idea of implementing the virtual SAN, the good thing is if you're running ESXi on it and you do have your storage available and you have multiple storage devices, you can actually create your own virtual SAN. All the devices don't have to be identical. You can actually create a SAN environment the way that you want to, which is actually a really neat thing, and it doesn't really cost you extra. Okay, now some of the things that you do add into vSphere, it does cost you a little bit more money. It does actually cost you a little bit more to make sure, but when you actually end up creating that cluster like we talked about, it automatically gives you that ability. So let's go back to my machine and let's take a look briefly again, and this is a reminder, we actually showed this in an earlier episode as well. So remember, I have this cluster A over here, cluster site A. And then when I selected that and I actually clicked on Manage, and then under Settings, you can see here's all the services that are actually available. So these things are turned on when you actually start clustering multiple ESX servers together. There's that DRS, not turned on, they actually are available to you, I should say that, because none of this is turned on. So DRS is available, there's that high availability, and here it is. Virtual SAN is available for you to actually be able to access as you need to. So if I click Edit here, this is where you can actually turn that on, and now you can actually take the appliances that cluster sees and create your own virtual SAN. Okay, get access to them, do what you need to. Now you might be saying, okay, but why the heck would I choose to do that? The reason why you actually want to create this virtual SAN, if you actually have issues and problems here, is actually with the very fact that you might have some SANs that are older than other SANs, and so it's kind of strange. We have at least here on the network, we have a SAN that has 16 drives in it, and it really has kind of like a gigabit kind of connection to the rest of the network. Now 5 years ago that was pretty fast. Okay, now you're kind of like, we need to get rid of it and go to 10 gig, go to something else that actually is faster. But at the same time, when you start taking a look at it, you might have devices like that, right? And you still want to actually put them into the virtual SAN and be able to create them together and do that. But why? Okay, the reason why is because you can actually take that now virtual SAN and actually implement policies on it. Okay, now why is that actually important? It's important especially because what you can do is you can create a service level kind of policy. I know technically that's not the actual word for it, but you can actually say, look, when it hits this particular level of connection or disk I/O or whatever it is, you can tell the virtual SAN you need to take action. Okay, so virtual SANs allow you to be able to do that. And when you have some particular action in which it falls below that provisioning service level, you can say, let's remediate that action. In other words, let's see what we actually have to do and maybe move some of the data off that virtual SAN onto other devices. So being able to actually remediate failures based on some type of policy of non-compliance, that's what you're actually taking a look at here. Okay? So virtual SANs can be a very important part of your storage environment inside of vSphere, but just kind of know that it's one of the options that you have available for you. Okay? The other thing, of course, is if you are actually one of those that really monitor storage, you want to do the virtual SAN. Because instead of you actually depending on that one interface, right, that comes from the device, don't get me wrong, that may give you all that you need. If you want to take advantage of all the monitoring that vSphere can do, implement a virtual SAN as well. That will give you kind of more, bells and whistles and dashes and dials and whatever else you want to see. So if you need that monitoring, that's what you also want to implement too. So vSANs are actually a way to go.
Now, Ronnie, you're talking about capabilities and having bells and whistles and things to play with. We also have virtual volumes as something we need to be aware of for the VCA exam as well, right?
Yes, virtual volumes kind of work like virtual SANs do. Okay, so it's kind of the same concept. Of course, but it's different. I mean, that's the stupidest statement ever, but that's the way to go with it, okay? Virtual SANs, okay, allow us, and I've said this in a previous episode, enable us to be able to have array-based access, okay? So if we don't just want to say, I want to pick this and this and this, and I want to create my own arrays out of devices, then I'm going to create it on that virtual volume level instead, and then I can actually manage it that way. The key thing here is, again, it actually goes to policy management more than anything. It's not about whether or not the device needs it, it's about how you want to control it, right? So there's something, and let me make sure I get another acronym out here. SPBM, okay, stands for Storage Policy Based Management. Allows you now to take that virtual SAN, okay, and be able to provide dynamic resources when you actually need it. Okay, so that's actually the key behind using the virtual volume instead. Okay, is that this way you can actually take a lot of the information here and actually create policies based off it and tell it, hey, I need to provision the storage based off of the policy that I set, not off of what the ongoing or the onboard stuff says it should be done that way. But the way that I actually want to manage it is what you also have the ability to do. So volumes allow you essentially more control than even what the virtual SAN allows you. Don't get me wrong, both technologies are really good, but if you actually need more detailed control, virtual volumes are the way to go. The storage policy-based management is the way to also go as well. Remember, those two terms together is the key when you're getting ready for something you're actually going to face in the future.
I'm impressed. You actually got storage based.
Yeah.
I can't do it.
Well, I read it.
Yeah. At a different level.
I had to actually look at my notes because these acronyms are starting to blend together.
They are, and it's not like they're small words. It's not like 4 or 5 letter words. These are like huge, chunky words that you got to throw all together. It can get a little confusing. So our recommendation to you as a person studying for this exam, make sure you go over those and get them squared away in your head so when you see them on the exam, you're able to, oh yes, I know that. That's, what is that, storagey? Storagey, that's a word. I'm making things up on the fly now. Storage policy-based management. You want to kind of know those types of terminology. Ronnie, anything else we need to know when it comes to storage and
Absolutely, you better believe it. There's always
there's
more.
Right?
That's right. Yeah, there's something else, and you're going to love this one. There's something that we call storage I/O control. Okay, storage I/O control, or SOIC, or SIOC. See, I can't even remember
add
which
a G
one.
and an F. And
add a couple more vowels, and we'll be there
Can
on
I
Wheel
buy
of
a
Fortune.
Valpat?
Sure, why not? So SIOC, Storage I/O, which stands for Input Output Control. Okay. Now, this is a technology that we do have inside of vSphere that really helps us more than anything else. Okay, is to protect the performance levels of our VMs. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. It really helps us to protect those performance levels. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay. Well, with storage I/O control, when that stuff is actually enabled, it really does guarantee that one particular VM is not going to become the I/O control resource hog as something is actually going on. Now, we actually have a situation like this happening on our encoding machine, right? Encoding is the hardest thing that you will do to a computer, right? It pegs CPU, memory, hard drive, you name it. It does everything. Okay, so as far as performance goes, that's what ends up happening. Well, that can actually be when we talk about encoding, right? One application saying, look, the CPU is mine. It doesn't care what everything else does. And well, think about that at a ESXi level, right? I have multiple VMs going on, okay? And now one VM says what? Hey, I need to ramp up because I'm doing so much more than what you're doing. And so it can take up all the I/O for that disk if it needs to. And then what does that mean for the other units? Well, it's the same thing, it's starvation, right? The very fact is they won't be able to get the I/O level the way that they need to. Does it mean that they'll stop functioning? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that they absolutely have that ability, okay, to continue on. But with SIOC, it can monitor for that, and it can say, look, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to guarantee certain levels here, okay? One device is not going to always overpower another one, okay? The other one, when I actually start sensing that something like that's happening, I will move it over to another disk that says what? The IOs are a little bit better here, okay, if we need to. And try and load balance them out is essentially what the storage I/O does. Now, when you take a look at that, this is where it actually is a little bit tricky in the interface. So let's take a look here briefly as well. So everything that we've been doing has pretty much been centered around this idea of the cluster, but notice that up here in the navigation pane, you also have this little disk here, right, that says storage if you hover over it. And so if I click on that now, and now notice that it's actually in the site itself, but now I'm focused on only the storage device itself. And so here is that clustered storage device. And if I select that, notice that in the Manage tab and then in Settings, if I go over here, I can see Data Store Capabilities, and it says Storage I/O Control is disabled. If I click Edit, this is where I can turn this on. And so it says Storage I/O Control is used to control the I/O usage of virtual machines and gradually enforce predefined share levels. That's what it's saying, is that, hey, I can guarantee that even if that guy's actually saying I'm going to hog everything, whatever level you set each VM at, I can manage that. I can control it for you. So you want to enable that, you simply select that, and there it is. And notice there's the congestion threshold, and then you can actually select those levels and even include in statistics if you want to actually help make that more granular and more detailed in the way that you want. So it really is a neat technology, especially when you have a ton of virtual machines. Not the 3 or 4 or 5 that I may run, but the 50 or 60 or 70 that you may run. Something like this is actually the one that says, I can manage all that stuff, let me do it. That's the way to actually go with this idea, especially when you have a lot of virtual machines that need access to all that storage and, of course, high performance as well.
Yeah, Ronnie, this really seems like the cherry on top of the proverbial cake here when it comes to storage in a virtual environment using vSphere or VMware, because it's saying, you know what, I'm not going to allow one poor little appliance out there to be the one that gets hammered all the time. I'm going to try to distribute that burden out amongst all the other drives and say, you know, I'm going to find an area that's not as utilized and let that take some of the burden. It's a very nice. Now, all the monitoring it does is insane, to be honest with you.
It really is, and there's a technical term, of course, I need to throw out there, right? So what it really is doing for those virtual machines is giving it what we call preferential I/O. Okay, so again, Daniel, I talk like this all the time, right? I mentioned preferential I/O, you know, all
daily
the
speech.
daily talk that we actually mentioned. But no, that's a term that you do want to associate with, well, storage I/O control as well. Again, for your future in the near future is what I'm meaning here. But just make sure that you understand that, right? That when you talk about that, making sure that VMs can actually get the performance that they need, regardless how all the other VMs are performing. That's what you actually want, is you want to make sure that that's implemented. That's one of the technologies. You want to understand that it's really providing the VM with that preferential I/O type of treatment. Make sure I'm saying, yeah, during resource congestion is what happens. So as more resources get congested, it says, no, I need to keep that amount of you know, I/O ready for my VM to be ready to perform as needed, or I can move it off to another device if you actually implemented like virtual volumes and you know, virtual volumes, I couldn't remember, SANs. Yeah, all that actually works together, right? So all the stuff that we've talked about in this episode and the previous one, they integrate together. I couldn't have done that, but somebody like VMware, vSphere, they're like, yeah, bring it on. We've got it.
And they've done a crack job of that, as we can see. A lot of really cool software. They've done a really good job of trying to make this simple, but we do need to understand these terms and understand what their technologies are, how they work, and what they're meant for, so you can pass your exam. We want you guys to get certified out there. Ronnie, anything else we need to cover before we wrap up the show?
Now, not in terms of covering for knowledge sake, but just again, I can't emphasize this enough, right? If you think that, hey, I'm just going to listen to this and I'll be able to take the exam, I'm not going to say you can't. It depends on your experience. But my suggestion, again, get some experience inside of VMware, right? vSphere 6, go ahead and take a look at it. Learn where these things actually are located. It's going to at least help prepare you as you go on towards your what do I want to say? VCP? Yeah, no, not VCP. Whatever it is next, VMP. Yeah, the Certified Professional, VCP
There you go.
6. It's going to help you there, but it will at least help you to relate the concepts that we've mentioned through this show back to something that's actually a real product. So the better associations, the more that you actually take a look at it, the better off you're going to be, and you're going to be prepared for the exam even better as well.
All right. Well, Ronnie, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. We appreciate it every time you stop by and do that for us so that we can get prepared and like you said, get ready for that exam, and then maybe even bump it up a notch down the road, as it were. But we've come to the end of yet another great episode. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it and even learned something. God help us all if you didn't.
Maybe.
That's right. That being said, we're going to go ahead and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
And we'll see you next time.